From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director. On today's program, we'll be talking with Khalid El-Guindi and Lara Friedman about the release of their recently completed 2022 Congressional Briefing Series on Israel and Palestine, Hot Topics in Congress. The 8-part webinar series features an array of Palestinian and Israeli voices, weighing in on some of the most pressing and timely Israel-Palestine-related topics in Congress. Khalid is a senior fellow at MEI and the director of the Program on Palestine and Israeli-Palestinian Affairs. Lara is the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Khalid, Lara, welcome back to the program, and thank you both very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having me.
For listeners that are interested in learning more, recordings of all 8 sessions, along with supporting materials, can be found on the MEI and FMEP websites. Links are included in the description for today's episode. Just wanted to flag that before we continue. Lara, to start off with, this is the second year now that you've done a congressional briefing series. But before we get into the specifics, can you give our listeners a sense of what the series is about and what it aims to achieve?
Sure. And thank you so much for giving us this opportunity to talk about what we're doing here. You know, with both these series, last year was the first one. And I think we both, Khalid and I, going into it, that was sort of an Israel-Palestine 101, trying to give people a baseline. And the fact is that Israel-Palestine is one of those issues that members of Congress and staff have to contend with constantly. Even if they don't focus on foreign policy normally, even if this maybe isn't an issue that you would think would be on the top of their agenda, given what state they're from or their constituents, this is an issue that comes up all the time. And it's an issue on which my experience working with the Hill would suggest there's a lot of interest and often not a lot of deep knowledge. So the goal of last year's series was that sort of baseline, you know, giving you your intro and then maybe a 101, 201, 301 all combined. And this year we decided to focus really on the issues themselves that we know that congressional staff and members get hit with all the time. So not so much in terms of trying to find controversial issues, but trying to find the ones that we know that they need to know about, you know, wherever they stand on the political spectrum. So that's the thinking behind the series overall. This is an educational series that's meant to expose staff and members, and then afterwards the general public, to some really in-depth discussion and thought and some really great minds.
Khalid, can you elaborate in a little bit more detail on the topics covered this year and what's new and different?
Yeah, sure. So we, of course, we cover a lot of the same ground in terms of looking at issues like settlements and Jerusalem and refugees. But as Lara said, we're going a little bit deeper and looking at those issues that are most relevant to Congress that keep coming up on the Hill and that are most pressing. And hence the name, hot topics in Congress. So we look at things like the apartheid debate, the fact that major human rights organizations, including Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, in addition to a few Israeli human rights groups and certainly Palestinian human rights groups, there's a sort of consensus that Israel is practicing apartheid. But of course, that sort of a label is extremely difficult, I think, for folks in American politics and particularly on the Hill. And so that's one issue that we tackle, head on. Where does the apartheid label come from? Is this just inflammatory language, or is there something to it? Things like Palestinian prisoners, which is another issue that keeps coming up in a negative sense, in that there really isn't a lot of understanding of the nature of the issue of Palestinian prisoners, how it resonates with Palestinians, the fact that Israel doesn't really have guarantees for due process. I mean, this is a military judicial system, right? So we're not talking about sort of basic rules of fairness. And so I think there's a certain perspective about Palestinian prisoners. Well, if a Palestinian is in an Israeli jail, they must be guilty of something, and probably terrorism. And so we try to unpack these issues. We look at the kind of dysfunction that is going on inside Palestinian politics, the fragmentation and political stagnation, as well as things like the planned evictions in places like Jerusalem and the standard issues like refugees in Gaza and so on.
Laura, what were your key takeaways from this year? What did you find most interesting and most surprising in the sessions?
It's an interesting question, because I think the takeaways for me are longer term. It's going to be really a question of what we see downstream. I mean, a couple of things stood out for me. One is the incredible, we saw this last year as well, the incredible readiness of people, of experts to participate in this series. One of the problems, I think, haunting Israel-Palestine policy discussions has been for years the absence of Palestinian voices. And the readiness of so many Palestinian experts from literally around the world. I mean, we had, on our last panel, we had a Palestinian expert who was appearing from Australia at 3 a.m. The readiness of people to come and engage in these conversations. And this isn't advocacy. This isn't weighing in on legislation and lobbying. This is trying to educate people about the issues. It was really striking to me how willing people were to come to the table and have these conversations with the hopes of educating. On the other side, I'll say, to the extent that we had, interactions with staff on this, they were universally positive. We didn't have, people emailing or getting on the calls yelling at us because we featured supporters of BDS, for example. And this went out. This was an 8-part series. So we were interacting with staff by email around this series for, around it for a total of almost 10 weeks. We had very few people unsubscribed from our list. We didn't get any negative feedback. The bottom line for me in terms of, the takeaways will be down the road. The hope is that having exposed so many staff members in Congress to these names, to these voices, to these ideas, will there be downstream impact? Will people come back to these videos when a question actually becomes a live issue? Maybe they only tuned in for part of it live, but now when it's an issue, maybe they'll want to learn more. Or will they think, hey, I remember there was this series and there was an expert talking about Gaza and Gaza's heating up again. Maybe I should seek them out. And that's really the hope down the road.
Helen, you touched on this a bit earlier, but of all the topics covered, where do you think there's the greatest need for education?
I think I would have to say, in terms of where there's greatest need, is on the side of Palestinian politics and society. And I think there's also, because as Laura indicated, there's a real dearth of information about Palestinians from Palestinians. And so that's really the added value of this series, is that we are bringing voices that folks on the Hill are unaccustomed to hearing from. And so there's also a real thirst for this kind of information. I mean, I think the reception has been really positive, as Laura indicated. It was interesting to me, just sort of anecdotally, that the 3 issues that seemed to be the most, that garnered the most attention from Hill staffers were Jerusalem and refugees, which is not surprising, and also prisoners. So I think because these are issues that keep coming up, and the sources of information that Hill folks are accustomed to getting are quite narrow and limited. And so there is not just a need for education, but a desire for it and a thirst for it. So I think that's the real value of this series.
Laura, given everything else that's going on across the region and indeed around the world, how much interest and bandwidth do you think there is on the part of Congress to engage on these issues right now?
I think the bandwidth question is always it's one that dogs everybody working, any issue you're working on, trying to figure out where Congress has energy and space to think about it. What we were trying to do with this series was, in some ways, I don't want to say ignore the bandwidth question. I mean, bandwidth around Israel-Palestine tends to be created when there is a crisis and suddenly people want information, suddenly people wish they knew more. And a lot of, I think, the thinking behind doing this as an annual series, maybe not timing it to go with a crisis, is to start laying the groundwork for the moment when there is that greater bandwidth, that there are resources that people already know about and that are maybe in their inbox, or maybe they've stored the email, or they remember that MEI or FMEP and they reach out to us and say, hey, what about that series? And that we've also, with this series, normalized the idea that there are Palestinian experts that people on the Hill can look to, right? I mean, just simply from the emails around this series, members and staff have seen the names of these experts now over and over, linked to articles. If you go to the website for each of the videos, there are articles, of that these people have written. There's resources. I mean, we've really built up kind of a world of knowledge that hopefully doesn't just in this exact moment break through and get heard, but lays the groundwork for this being a source of wisdom, a source of counsel when suddenly there is more bandwidth because there is a crisis or there is legislation being considered or something like that.
Khaled, I'm curious now that this is the second year that you've done this, kind of comparing last year to this year, how do you think the atmosphere and environment in Washington has changed? Do members and staff seem more or less receptive? And do you feel like there's a kind of cumulative effect from having done this 2 years in a row now?
Yeah, I mean, well, to take that first part, the second part first, yes, I do think there's a cumulative effect. It's also true that bandwidth is a consistent issue on Capitol Hill, right? These are staffers who are working on multiple issues at any given moment, multiple foreign policy issues at any given moment. There's a clear difference in terms of the environment this year versus last year. Obviously, the Ukraine war is taking up a lot of that bandwidth. Last year, we had a new government in Israel. We had the prospects, back then we thought there were going to be Palestinian elections. This year, of course, we've got, a different environment as Laura indicated. But I think, as Laura said, the value is in having this information available for staffers, but not just staffers or folks on the Hill. This is an incredibly useful resource for educators at different levels, at universities, at high schools. I can see a lot of social studies classes using these resources. And in fact, that was our experience last year. We found that the downstream use, even beyond Capitol Hill, was really intense, and I would expect that we're going to see something very similar this year once we release it publicly.
Laura, Khaled just touched on this, but as the war in Ukraine has demonstrated over the past month and a half now, the U.S., Europe, the international community are clearly capable of rapid, robust action to oppose occupation and support international law. Do you think any of that sentiment or that sense of urgency will carry over? And you think it could possibly prompt people to look at the situation in Israel-Palestine differently or perhaps with fresh eyes?
Look, I mean, that is a question that I think a lot of us are grappling with, and a lot of really brilliant people, including some of the people we had in this series, have spoken about this and are writing about it. I think the Ukraine crisis has certainly been a teachable moment when it comes to challenges in the U.S. about free speech. Where is there a right to protest, and where is that right to protest in forms of supporting boycotts, say? Where is that right celebrated and embraced, and where is it demonized, and why is that a problem? I think I think the last word hasn't been said on this, but I mean, this is going to be a live issue going forward, and this is again a place where I think what we did with this last series in terms of really centering Palestinian voices and centering particularly younger Palestinian voices who speak a language of international law and justice, and they speak it fluently and they speak it really quite compellingly. I think that does make a difference. Will it make the difference? Will it shift policy on its own? I mean, I think it can contribute to that, and we hope to have contributed to that with this series.
Khaled, anything you want to add on that point?
No, I mean, I would just underscore the point that Laura made, that I think this particular moment, and given the war in Ukraine, it really has been a clarifying moment in terms of, I think people are a lot more aware of the double standards on how different issues are dealt with in the public sphere, in the media, in Congress, and just the public debate in general. That it's okay to boycott in certain cases, but why is it not okay in other instances? What is political or what isn't political, or what's considered political, as opposed to simply an issue that is compelling in a human sense. We live here in Washington, and we're maybe a little bit jaded because everything seems political, and everything in a way is political. I think the Ukraine crisis has been clarifying in that it's underscored that beyond the politics, there's a human element, to these conflicts and to these crises in different parts of the world. And I think that's certainly true in this case. And I think it's partly why there is so much interest in this series.
Before we wrap up, I wanted to give both of you the chance to offer your concluding thoughts, starting with you, Lara.
Thanks. Listen, I appreciate this podcast, and I hope people will take some time and listen to the series or watch it. It was an extraordinary experience for me as a moderator, sitting back and being able to listen to some of these voices. I will say that the session on apartheid, which we've already released, we released that publicly early because it was so timely. It just seemed like we couldn't not release it publicly. Is really quite an extraordinary exploration into an issue that's truly a hot topic at the moment. And I think it really is worth watching. I will also say the one that I think is probably going to be in some ways the most surprising for people who don't follow Israel-Palestine issues in depth, maybe the depth that they should, is the session on BDS, which was truly a powerful and extremely honest, and I would say extremely compelling exploration of the topic. And, folks have very strong opinions on a lot of things, including on the right to boycott or whether boycott shouldn't be allowed on Israel-Palestine. And I really would encourage people to take the time to listen to that one very closely. Can I add just one thing?
Sure, absolutely.
I also want to say it was once again a pleasure to do this with the Middle East Institute and Khaled El-Gindi. The partnership between the Foundation and the Middle East Institute is something that is extremely important, and we are so grateful to be able to do this together with Khaled and the Middle East Institute.
Oh, well, I mean, for sure, it's mutual. So our partnership with FMAP is incredibly important to our work. So thank you, Lara.
We'll have to leave things there for today. But Lara, Khaled, thank you both for joining us on the program.
Thanks, Alistair.
Thanks.
That was Lara Friedman and Khaled El-Gindi. Again, recordings of all 8 sessions of the Congressional Briefing Series can be found on both of our websites at www.mei.edu and www.fmep.org. That's all the time we have this week. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in and to our production team for their work on this week's episode. You can follow MEI on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Alistair Taylor. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.